Right, opening remark. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Let's go ahead and get started with Undersecretary.
Right. Thank you, Madam Chair, Senators. Mike Wilkening, Undersecretary of Health and Human Services. We've been in negotiations with the federal government on the funding at Sonoma Developmental Center. I would love to be able to tell you that we had an agreement, and unfortunately we do not at this point. The funding was slated to sunset today. We're expecting to receive a letter later today that will extend that to June 6th so that they give us enough time to reach an agreement with them. I'm still hopeful that we will reach an agreement that will continue federal funding for a time-limited period, and we aren't sure how long that period's going to be. We do know that there will be some components to any agreement that's reached. One is that the federal funding will be time-limited in nature, so it will not just be an open, they'll continue funding in perpetuity. They will, in all likelihood, require additional monitoring during the time period that they provide the additional funding. We don't know what that looks like yet, but that's how they've done other extensions, that there's been some monitoring of the developmental centers during that period. There will likely, they've expressed a desire to have a decrease in the populations in the developmental centers. They're not asking for a closure of the developmental centers, but they are asking that we continue to move people into the community as it's appropriate, which of course is also our goal as well. And that it would not apply to the 4 units at Sonoma that have already been, that we voluntarily decertified at the beginning of this process. So we would not get federal funding for those 4. So like I said, June 6th is when they're going to extend to, and I'm hopeful that we'll reach an agreement during that time period, hopefully in the next couple of weeks.
So can I ask you just a process question on that? Since this is a budget subcommittee and the budget will be done by June 15th. So tell me process, if June 6th isn't the magic day, how does that impact the budget?
You know, I think I've got a more immediate need even in that I have the governor's May revision coming out next week.
That's right.
And so we're right now in the middle of having internal discussions about what the May revision is going to assume and then how we would address any issues that change from that. So I expect that we'll be back right after the May revision and be able to tell you what we've assumed, and I'm hoping that I can at that point tell you that we have even more progress or an update on how close we are.
Senator.
Well, first of all, let me say that I hope you do get the certification so that we can get those federal funds coming in, but in the event that we don't, so that means we'll have 11 sections, if you will, of the Sonoma campus that we're not getting the federal money for. In a worst case scenario, what kind of a backfill are we looking at in the next year's budget if we don't get funding?
I'm going to turn to the department for the number on the additional 7 units.
We'll cover that.
It's like the backfill would be about 44 million.
44?
For Sonoma. Yeah.
And would you see that the general fund is the only source of money that could be used to backfill that?
I don't know of another fund source.
Okay. Thank you.
Like I said, I wish I had an agreement that I could share with you today, but we're still in progress.
Schedule a hearing for this date. It's all around that. Thank you very much. Mr. Doyle?
Actually, Dwayne LaFond again. Sorry.
I look at you as welcoming. I'm sorry. I'm going to get it straight before the budget's over. Yes, sir.
I'm going to go into the what we call the PIPs, which are program improvement plans. The costs that were associated with those and general fund costs are on page 10 of your agenda. The PIPs were, program improvement plans were actual technical agreements that were entered into by the developmental centers with CDPH and CMS to stay termination of federal reimbursement at the DCs. So the costs and the contracts that were associated with the PIP agreements were so that we could maintain our funding, federal funding, all during these past couple of years. The PIPs required a contract for an independent consultative review expert, and that expert was to come in and do a root cause analysis, which would lead to specific action plan steps that in turn would lead to the acquisition of the necessary conditions of participation to meet the federal guidelines. So once that action plan was approved, that piece was monitored by the independent consultative review expert. It had 30, 60, 90, 120, and 150-day guidelines and steps that was monitored all the way along. And so those were all the efforts that were made by then. Each center had an individualized action plan based on their root cause analysis. And the monitoring throughout really showed that they were doing well on meeting those. By the time that all of the centers met their 120 to 150 days, they were 100% on all of their process items and in the 90s on the other measures that, the effectiveness measures that would have talked about the long-term maintenance of those issues. So when you looked at those PIP action plans, everything did look good at the time. The other issue that needed to be addressed during this time is that we found that at the centers, they had a number of filled but undelivered positions. Each center averaged about 134 undelivered positions in full-time equivalents. And so we developed through the root cause analysis that relief factor of what we call the PIP staffing positions to deliver about 114 on average FTEs to put real direct care staff in place. That's been a continuing challenge as our turnover is at about the same rate that we've been hiring. So we're making improvements, but it's been slower than we would like on that. And then finally, we did another competitive proposal, which was not really part of the PIP funding, but we contracted with H&W Innovative Solutions for additional service to provide training at the centers on internal monitoring and regulatory compliance. So that's really the basic of the activities around the PIPs and trying to retain certification. With respect to the nature of investigations at the centers with US DOJ, as you've indicated on page 11 of the agenda, DDS has received a notification regarding a civil investigative demand at Sonoma Developmental Center. We've produced a large number of documents for them, and they've been engaged with our attorneys, and there's really no change on that at this point. We don't really have any understanding. Our contention really is that we have Medicaid and CMS-related programs to provide the appropriate oversight and remedial process, and that's pretty much where we stand right now.
Any questions before we move on to the LAO? Can I get your general sense that the PIP funding has been since, fiscal year, as I look at the chart on page 10, I look at the PIP funding for fiscal year 13, 14, 14, 15, and what's proposed for 15, 16. How do I frame this? Are we getting the results worthy of our investment? You follow me? You get what I'm trying to say?
I may be following you. As far as the actual action plans and the results of those action plans, I wouldn't say that we got what the contract required, and I think we were clear about that when we did our assessment of the contract. With respect to the PIP staffing to help us fill behind undelivered staff and the way that the staffing requirements changed over time. If you had, in the past, if you had undelivered staff, you used to be able to put your money into a blanket and hire temp help, and you'd have some consistent staff. That's changed over time. You really need position numbers to go with positions, and so the ability to fill behind undelivered staff is really critical, and we are seeing some benefit from that in seeing some, at least if not overtime costs go down. In some cases, we're seeing overtime costs go down. In other instances, we're seeing some of the acuity with being able to have people in restraint less because of their behavioral issues. those one-to-one staffings are really, even though we're hiring more staff, you're still not seeing the overtime come down because of the behavioral acuity a lot of times that we have with some of our more difficult individuals. But we are seeing that pay off in the fact that we're really providing more supportive programs in that way and more consistency in the staff and the way the staff approach our folks.
Thank you. We'll hear from the LAO.
Sean Martin with the Legislative Analyst's Office. In our 2015-16 analysis of the Health and Human Services budget released in February, we identified significant policy and fiscal reasons for closing Fairview and Sonoma developmental centers. On a policy basis, both federal and state law and various court rulings have clarified the policy of moving away from the institutional care that's provided in developmental centers towards community-based services and supports, and I'll give you some examples. In 1990, the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act was enacted to prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability in the provision of government programs. And in the Olmstead decision by the United States Supreme Court, it held that under ADA, states must provide services and supports to individuals with developmental disabilities in the most integrated settings appropriate. Furthermore, the Caulfield versus Department of Developmental Services case in 1990, known as the Caulfield lawsuit, alleged unnecessary placements of persons in DCs who could be placed in the community. And the case was settled in 1994, resulting in more than 2,000 developmental center consumers being moved out into the community. AB 1472, statutes of 2012, was enacted. Among its provisions was a moratorium placed on developmental center admissions with limited exceptions for individuals involved in the criminal justice system. And in the California Health and Human Services Agency's report, The Plan for the Future of the Developmental Centers, the Secretary states today's state and federal laws and court decisions clearly favor community integration of institutional care defined nationally as congregate care facilities with a capacity of 16 residents or more. So that's the policy basis that we're outlining. On a fiscal basis, in our analysis of the budget, we took a look at 179 consumers who'd moved out of Lanterman Developmental Center and into the community. And for those 179 individuals, we had 1 year of data on their community costs. Now, as we noted earlier, it costs over $500,000 a year for a developmental center bed. The range, that's total funds. The total fund cost, including their Medi-Cal cost, for the 179 that moved out into the community was between $75,000 and $300,000 per person. So we think on a fiscal basis, it makes sense to move people out into the community. So in summary, on a fiscal basis, we find providing services and supports to DC residents in the community settings is cost effective. On a policy grounds, the provision of services and supports in integrated community settings is consistent with court decisions, with state policy, with federal law. So we are recommending that DDS should close both Fairview and Sonoma developmental centers within 10 years, and we would defer to the department's judgment on which developmental center they should close first. I might add that we are also believe that it's important to, for the general population section in Porterville Developmental Center, we think it's important over that time period to phase out that segment of the population too, and we recognize that there are some difficulties with closing the secure treatment program in Porterville due to the interactions with the courts. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from members? Senator McGuire.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. Greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here with you and the rest of the Budget Subcommittee today. Thank you so much. I think a couple items just very quickly on the LAO's report. I do want to thank the Legislative Analyst's Office for the amazing work that you do every year and the recommendations that you do make. I'm grateful for that. I think on this one specific area where have some concerns is related to the issue of services. And in particular, and I'll just focus on the Sonoma Developmental Center, the greater region where I work and represent. I think some of the most significant challenges, if we're looking at a potential closure, are having appropriate housing, particularly SB 962 homes, for those individuals that have the most complex medical needs. within our communities. And that needs to be taken into consideration, because right now, being very frank, those services simply aren't there at the moment. In addition, as recognized by the administration last year, you have a percentage of those that are at the Sonoma Developmental Center that are the most medically fragile in the system, and would be challenged to actually move at all. And taking that into account of any type of transition plan, and we did see that additional budget allocation in last year's budget. Couple other items. Looking at the, again, do appreciate all the due diligence of the LAO. I think the other piece is needing to be able to design and build a new model of homes to provide intensive wraparound therapeutic behavioral services. And that's what we have right now at the SDC, are those services that are available. And concern of looking at community placements, of ensuring that those services are actually going to be available for the residents, many of whom have called the SDC home for several years, or in most cases, decades. And I think the other piece is taking into account the specialty services such as shoemaking shops, wheelchair specialty clinics that are available for those individuals that call the SDC home. And I think my last item is just timing, and always needed to be able to take into account the residents' care first, and completely understand the issue of the budget. And one of the reasons why we're continuing to see skyrocketing budget is because we're no longer enrolling as well. And we need to make sure that we are responsible, that if we do act, that the services are actually going to be available. And in the county of Sonoma, despite the robust process that has been happening on the local level, and I do want to say thank you, particularly to the chairwoman from the Board of Supervisors who is here today, being able to act on those services is going to take some significant effort and, frankly, dollars if this is going to be coming forward from the federal government. And I do appreciate that, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. With that, we will invite Supervisor Gorn to bring remarks. The balance of the panel are community activists who have been asked by the committee to share their general perspective on this critical issue of the future of developmental centers. Again, I will ask you all to keep your comments to within 4 to 5 minutes, please. Supervisor, welcome.
Thank you so much. Excuse me, I have recovering from a cold here. It is such a pleasure to be here, and I certainly appreciate your comments, Senator Stone, and always recognize the efforts of Senator McGuire. As an elected leader, I truly understand the challenges of trying to look at budgeting and look at ways to reduce the costs. But let's put this in context. Sonoma Developmental Center, as we know, is the oldest developmental center in the state of California. Aging infrastructure, for sure. Previously, the largest employment center and industry in Sonoma County, currently the largest employer in Sonoma Valley, serving over 400 residents, about 12 or 1,300 employees, very highly skilled employees, third or fourth generation employees serving at the center quite nobly and ably. And we all acknowledge here the uniqueness and the complexity of the remaining residents at the developmental center. And I won't go into the complexity of their needs. We've all identified exactly the challenges that we have serving the residents here. Some of the residents actually have been in community placement and found that it was impossible to meet the intent of the Lanterman Act and then move back into the developmental center to do exactly that. So I think it's really important as we move forward to look at the individualized needs of each resident and to make the best decision possible on the placement of that individual. Should they remain in the developmental center? Should they be transitioned into the community? Should staff follow them into the community? Those are really complex questions, and that gets to the heart of our discussion here today. I think we acknowledge the moral imperative of caring for our most vulnerable, but we also need to ask what's best for the individual, and I think that that's at the heart of the matter, recognizing the increasing fiscal costs of operating a developmental center. We, in Sonoma County, this has been my top priority as supervisor representing this area, and now it has become one of the top priorities for Sonoma County. We recognize both the responsibility and the privilege of having Sonoma Developmental Center in Sonoma County serving our residents, and we have constructed a very broad-based coalition of community groups with the Parent Hospital Association, 6 different county departments and agencies expending resources on this, many community groups, and we're so thankful that representatives of the Department of Developmental Services and representatives from our legislators and the regional centers are all coming together to ask that very question, the best place possible for our residents. We recognize that not only are their medical needs complex, but as Senator McGuire suggested, many of us, we recognize Sonoma County and the North Bay are very, very challenged and expensive to create community facilities in. If it would have been easy to place these individuals in the community, quite frankly, it would have been done before. But between the cost of housing, the limited inventory, the limited availability of constructing facilities in the community, let alone the gap in services to provide the huge array of 24/7 services that these individuals need, demand in order to meet their potential, we haven't identified those gaps. We haven't identified the services necessary. We haven't estimated the cost of providing those wraparound services that they currently receive at the developmental centers. It's going to take us a very long time to figure this out. Our coalition has created a services model team, and we hope to create a third way. Not just the developmental center, not just community placement, but to create a unique, innovative hub of serving both populations on the asset of the developmental center. I recognize the cost of operating the center, we all do. But this center is so valuable and so unique that let's seize the opportunity to work together to create the services necessary to meet the broader population of developmentally disabled folks in the North Bay, as well as continuing services on the assets that we've invested in on the site, bringing in educational facilities to meet those needs. I think we have an opportunity here to work with the department and the legislature to create a different way, a model that could be replicated nationwide. But we need time. We need your support. We need your patience and your continued presence at the coalition and the departmental meetings that will create that model. We are known in Sonoma County for our expertise and our innovation nationwide. Let us once again be the model for the future of California. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Supervisor. Ms. Miller.
Thank you for letting me speak today. Thank you all. My name is Kathleen Miller. I'm the president of PHA. It's the organization that represents the residents and families of Sonoma Developmental Center. I want to put to bed a few misconceptions that I've been hearing about developmental centers in general, but SDC in particular. The first misconception is that SDC somehow doesn't provide quality care. As PHA president and mother of one of the residents, rarely a week goes by that I'm not there. I'm there all the time. And the SDC families, who you're going to hear from later, are also frequent visitors, and we get to see firsthand the care that our loved ones receive there, and we talk to the staff and we hear about any concerns. And we continue to believe that the care our loved ones receive there is of the highest quality and includes the range of services that they need to meet their needs. The reason that the federal funding is at risk for some of the residents at SDC has more to do with the federal government than the quality of care. The federal government has a stated goal of not wanting to continue funding for what they refer to as institutions, and we see as the home and community of our family members. We are the ones who are there. We are the ones who see what goes on, and not those who speak out against the centers. We are the ones with loved ones who live there who have the most to lose if the care there does not continue to be of the highest quality. Those who no longer wish to live there are free to leave, and we fully support their choice. But we have a hard time understanding why we are refused the support for the choice of those who wish to remain at SDC. Misconception 2. Community care settings would have no problem caring for SDC residents even if it closed immediately. As we've heard, our residents have significant challenges. I'm not going to go into all the data, but I do want to say that 37% have severe behavior problems, 41% mental illness, 43% need behavior medications. These are individuals who are going to be tough. And many residents have medical issues along with these conditions as well. So placement for these folks is going to be pricey, and they're going to need a full array of services. When Agnews and Latterman were closed, they were located in urban settings where housing, medical supports, and providers were more available. SDC provides these services for SDC residents, but those services that are needed are not always available to those in community settings. And if they are not developed in the area, the placement of SDC residents in community settings will only be adding to the problem of those who lack what they already need. We need time to develop the housing, the dental, the psychiatric and psychological care, and more to meet the needs of those not only who are living in SDC, but some in the community who need these services as well. This is the model that Supervisor Gorin is talking about. Misconception number 3 I want to talk about is that all was well with the Agnews and Latterman closures. The determination that these closures were a success is based largely on the fact that they were closed. The DCs were closed. During the time of the Agnews closure and later the Latterman closure, I wanted to find out if there was an increase in deaths during the closure process. I learned that the only thing I was able to find out was once an individual leaves the center, this information wasn't being carefully tracked. There are a number of other things that are not being tracked in community settings, and they include how often and how individuals are behaviorally restrained or placed in seclusion, right? How many individuals are going into acute psych settings because their community settings are not able to deal with their mental illness or their behaviors, including how many individuals die and how they die in community settings. The only thing we know is that at any one time there is about 200 in jail, and I'm not talking about Porterville. So while we are aware that many leaving the centers are successful and we celebrate that success, we lack the data to know about those who struggle and those who die. And what we are left with is lovely stories of those who are successful, but the tragic stories of those who are not. No stories. I mean, just stories, no facts. There's more, but I'm going to cut it because I know you're in a hurry. I also want to talk about the misconception 4 that when the developmental centers close, it's going to free up millions of dollars that can go to community care settings and help shore up that system that's falling apart. We know that closing a DC is expensive. The Agnews costs for homes to develop were over $1 million per home. And while Latterman homes cost less, it is more likely that Sonoma costs will be closer to the Agnews amount. Sonoma may be rural and lovely, but it is expensive. Beyond that, the service models that work for our types of complex SDC residents, particularly those that still remain, will also be expensive. In fact, those who have moved to community settings from developmental centers and those with similar issues are probably some of the most expensive in the DDS system to care for. But the main issue is that the fact that centers have been closing for over 40 years is that during each closure, the argument has always been the same. It will free up funds for the community settings. It has never happened. It's not going to happen this time. And all that really happens is another center closes. Fortunately, we do have good news, and that is the Sonoma Coalition, and it has been formed and is operating. It's been operating for over 2 years. It's a group of community stakeholders that are committed to the transformation of SDC and to the implementation of the recommendations of the task force on the future of developmental centers, including SDC. The Sonoma Coalition was formed to take on a mission of planning for a new vision for the future of SDC. Their mission is broad and encompassing and is focused on community collaboration for the land, the water, reuse of the facility, and creation of a wellness center that includes a focus on those individuals
Ms. Miller,
with developmental
at
disabilities.
8 minutes, I'm just going to have to ask you to wrap it up,
Okay.
please.
Well, I can conclude with that. I had one more paragraph, but let's let it ride.
You can feel free to give it to the sergeants, and we'll make sure that the members get a copy of your written testimony.
I will be happy to do that.
Thank you
so
very much. Appreciate you.